Good morning. I want to start today off with a quick visual illustration. In a moment, an image is going to appear on the screen, and I want you to look at it and read just what it says. So as you look at this image right here, what does it say? For most people, when they first see this picture here, it may read something like, "I like to eat puppies." And if that's what you saw at first glance, you are not alone. And that's exactly how a lot of people interpret it when they see it for the first time. But what if I told you that that is not actually what the image says? It doesn't say, "I like to eat puppies." What it actually says is, "I like to eat, I like puppies." So why does that meaning change? I'm going to explain it to you because music literacy matters. So the first time when you see this picture, and this is how it actually reads, is, "I like to eat, period." Reason why is because there is a repeat sign at the end of eat, and the one above there, above to eat, is the first ending. So when you read this, it says, "I like to eat," and then you have to go back and start back at the beginning. So then you go back to "I like." So then the next picture is when you go back to "I like," you skip that first ending and go to the second ending, which says puppies, and a double bar at the end is signaling the end. So when you read this, it actually is, "I like to eat and I like puppies." Now that I've explained how to read this image to you, the interpretation completely changes, doesn't it? And once you know how to read it correctly, now you can't unsee it. So the reason I chose this image is I've seen this image floating around the internet for a while. It's actually from a meme, and there's a t-shirt that says "Music Literacy Matters." And there is a reason for that. And so the thing is, the mind reads what it is trained to read. Likewise, it will speak as it's always been spoken to. And the title of this message is called "Don't Believe Everything You Think." The issue isn't always what we hear, it's how we interpret it. Like the image that was posted a moment ago, sometimes our interpretations of our narratives that we play in our head isn't 100% accurate. All of us narrate. However, most of us never intentionally choose the narrator. I'm going to repeat that one more time. All of us narrate. However, most of us never intentionally choose the narrator. Every one of us walks through life with a narrator in our mind. That narrator is constantly interpreting what happens to us, and when something goes wrong at work, the narrator says, "You're not good enough." Or maybe when someone doesn't return the text in the time frame that you sent it and that you'd expect them to return the text from, the narrator says, "They must be upset with you." Or when you make a mistake and the narrator says, "You mess things up all the time." So here's the thing. Most of us assume that the narrator is telling the truth. But the truth is sometimes the narrator is just repeating these old interpretations that we've carried for so many years. So that begs us to ask the question, then who trained that narrator? And that brings me to my first point. The battle is in the mind. Once you start paying attention to the inner narrator, you realize something pretty quickly. Your mind is not quiet. It's constantly interpreting, evaluating, replaying conversations, worrying about the future, criticizing yourself, and maybe even comparing yourself to others. There's a constant stream of thoughts moving through our minds every single day. In a 2020 study published by Julie Sang and Jordan Popnek of Queen's University in Canada, they suggested that humans have about 6,000 thoughts per day. And this can range for something simple like, hey, I need to go get a drink of water, which I'm actually going to do right now because I just thought about that my throat is a little bit parched, so I'm going to drink some water. Or it can move on to something a little bit more complex, like something that happened in a relationship that you have with somebody. Maybe something was said and you're ruminating about that. Or maybe it's a stream of feelings that's going on in your life right now that you just are struggling to organize very well. The study claims you have, so at that 6,000 thoughts per day, it's actually a little more than 6,000, but it's about on average 6.5 thoughts per minute. Did you realize that you have 6.5 thoughts per minute? And I bet you most of us rarely stop to ask the question, where are those thoughts coming from? And Scripture actually tells us the mind is not a neutral state. There is a real battle happening up in here. Not battles of weapons, but a battle of ideas, interpretations, arguments, and beliefs. And this is exactly why the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth saying, in 2 Corinthians 10:5, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. I want you to notice the words Paul uses here. He doesn't say we demolish people. We demolish arguments. Those are the ideas that compete with what God truly says about us and what God says is true. He talks about thoughts, pretensions, things that set themselves up against the knowledge of God. In other words, battles happen in the mind where ideas and interpretations live. And what's really fascinating is that the psychologists have observed this exact same biblical principle. Counselors have often used simple super framework called the ABC model, which comes from the cognitive behavioral therapy. According to Kristen Nunes of Healthline.com, the ABC model stands for A is for action or event. That means something has to happen. B is for the belief that you form about that event. And C is for the consequence, how you feel or how you respond. And what this model explains is that A doesn't actually cause C. Can you actually put that back up there, Rudy? Thank you. What this model explains is that A does not actually cause C. The event itself does not force your reaction. You don't have to react to an event that has happened. What determines your outcome is B, and that is the belief or the story or the argument you attach to the event in your mind. And if those beliefs, those thoughts, they repeat long enough, they actually begin to shape how we live. So I need you to hear these three simple truths. Not every thought that enters your mind is true. Just because a thought appears does not make it a reality. And not every thought that enters your mind is from God. Sometimes thoughts come from fear, past wounds, or maybe even the enemy himself. And not every thought deserves your agreement. We all have God-given abilities to examine what enters our mind. And this is why Paul says we need to take every thought captive. If thoughts didn't cause harm, there'd be no reason to capture them. But thoughts shape beliefs, and beliefs shape actions, and then the actions shape our destiny. The enemy doesn't begin by changing our circumstances or the things around us. He begins by changing how we interpret them, and that is the battlefield. I'm going to state those two sentences again. The enemy doesn't really begin by changing our circumstances or the things around us. He begins by changing how we interpret them. And that is why we need to keep captive all our thoughts, because that is the battlefield. And this leads me to my next point. Our minds were trained. Negative thoughts are often learned patterns. Kids are incredibly adaptive. When love feels uncertain, they figure out ways on how to secure it and how to navigate it. See, growing up in my life, my home was a little bit complicated. I come from a broken home where my parents divorced when I was 3, and my dad had full custody of me. And when he remarried, I spent a lot of time with a stepmom who was narcissistic and verbally harsh. That is my story, and like a lot of kids in that situation, I learned to walk very carefully. If I argued with my stepsister, I would get in trouble. And if I was good, then I was liked. So with that, I started to believe that if I did everything right, I'd earn the love I was so seeking after, especially from a person that was a mother-like figure in my life. So I built this internal rule: get good grades, don't get in trouble, perform well, and people will approve of me. And the problem is, over time, that voice, that someone else's voice, that ended up turning into my own voice. And that voice became a harsh reality that pushed me to stay very calculated and not take many risks. Because the reason why I didn't want to take risks is because if I took a risk and I failed, people wouldn't love me and people wouldn't like me. That is the narrative I built for myself. And that all stemmed from early childhood and the issues that I had growing up when I was a kid. And I couldn't handle that idea of failure because that means I would feel alone. But like I said, that was a narrative I built for myself. And a lot of people that maybe listen to this right now, they know exactly what that feels like. And it took me many years to realize that not every thought that runs through my mind is actually telling me the truth. See, for me, my strive for perfection, I had this idea that perfection equated to acceptance. That if I was perfect at what I did, people would like me and love me and would finally accept me. And that's not really true. And here's also the deal with that one. It doesn't really come with peace at all because you're striving for something that you'll never obtain, so you'll never have the peace in your life to be able to obtain it. So when I began to pay attention to the thoughts that were running through my mind, I realized many of them weren't truth at all. They were just old, repeated patterns and interpretations that I learned as a child. And I carried them on into adult years. And I carried them for a very, very long time. I'd say probably close to 25 years. And those interpretations we learned through childhood continues to run in autopilot until they are fully examined. And I don't share my story to blame anybody. I'm not putting blame on my ex-stepmom or anything like that. I share it because many of us carry stories that shaped how we see ourselves. And I came to the realization that it's my responsibility to completely examine the thoughts that are running through my head. It's nobody else's responsibility but my own. See, during our formative years, and when I talk about our formative years, my story happened between the ages of 6 and 11, 5 and 11, somewhere around there. So it was right during those crucial formative years in a childhood's life of how they see themselves and how they see everybody else around them and how they see their parental figures, etc. So during our formative years, we learn to interpret ourselves through our parents and through authority figures, the culture around us, the failures and comparisons to other kids our age. We are learning what brings approval, what brings rejection, and what we have to do to feel accepted and navigate all those feelings that we're going through during those years. And those childhood mechanisms are deep and very foundational into how our minds were trained. But the training didn't stop when we grew up. It's happening right now as we speak. Every single day, it's through our patterns, through the people that we hang out with, through the screens in our living room, and even in our pockets. So let's bring it to today's culture for a minute. Not just childhood, but let's bring it to today. Let's think about social media for a minute. It's all algorithms. It's an equation. It's you plus something else equals results. Let's say, for instance, you search for the latest TV, do a Google search for the latest TV that's out there. And you're looking at some websites for the TV because you really need to get a new TV. What happens when all of a sudden, maybe 10 minutes later or half an hour later, you hop up on your Facebook feed? What shows up? That same TV that you just searched. And maybe similar TVs that are like it. Or you watch a recipe reel on Instagram, and then all of a sudden you start flipping through more reels. What happens? You start seeing more recipe reels. So here's the deal. When you are scrolling and you pause for even just 1 second longer on an image or a post, it's like, hey, that person likes that. For instance, I was on Facebook and there was some stats about football. It was about some old NFL teams that were no longer around, or how they transitioned into the NFL teams that are today. So I clicked on the image and I was reading this whole long post. It was an image. Now what happens on my Facebook feed? I'm getting all these different football stats. All these different years of, this is how this NFL team's helmet used to look back in the 50s, or this is how it used to look back in the 70s, and now this is how it looks today, or how the helmets changed colors, or how the teams changed, or people who retired too early that were in the middle of their prime. Just because I looked at that one picture, now it's giving me all these football things. So when you're scrolling and you just pause for 1 second longer to read the post, it follows you. That is what the algorithms do. It's trained to learn how you operate. Because your mind is the consumer. It is meant to show you everything you're interested in. And it's meant to be appealing and to capture your mind and capture your attention. So now, social media has been around for 20-some years. Let's go even more modern here in the last couple of years. AI, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude. When people interact with AI, here's the thing, it doesn't really challenge you. It listens to the prompt that you enter in, and it responds accordingly. In many ways, it reflects back what you feed it. And that's the part why it feels so comfortable to interact with AI. It responds politely, it affirms you, it gives you information in a way that feels agreeable. The conversation is never challenged unless you prompt AI to challenge you. But why would we want to do that, right? I joke, and that was meant to be a laugh. I joke, but it's the truth. We live in a microwave society. And what do I mean by that? Our society and our culture have trained us to take the easy route, find the fastest way to perform tasks. I'm all for automation. I've used AI. I use AI for my work. And one example that I had is that I had a customer request certain information in a certain format that's emailed with every shipment. And all I needed was a couple of data points. So I go to our system to grab a couple of data points, but I needed to have something where I typed it into an Excel form, and then I had to save it and print it off as a PDF and email it to the customer. Well, instead of having to do all the manual tasks every time, I went to AI to develop a macro. And what I did was I said, hey, I built this Excel spreadsheet that matches the way the customer wants to see it. What I want to do is I want a button at the bottom of this Excel spreadsheet. So when I type in the data that I need to type in, all I got to do is push that button. It saves the Excel. It saves it as a PDF, and then opens up Microsoft Outlook to the specific email addresses that I need to send it to. It attaches that PDF, creates my subject line, and creates the body of the text. So all it does is pop up at Outlook, and all I got to do is click send. So I used AI to do that. Why? Because I wanted to make my life easier, and I didn't want to outsource it to somebody else that nobody in my company would be able to do that. So AI is great to be able to automate things to save you time. But there is a time frame and a good way to utilize AI, and there's also a negative way to utilize AI, and I'll get to that later. So the whole thing with AI and the algorithms is there are good things about it and there's bad things about it. I want the algorithms to continue showing me fail videos of people screwing up and it's caught on camera, or the Instagram reels where there's an AI generated video of a cat bursting through a door with a banjo, waking up their owner at midnight, just being loud and obnoxious. Those things are funny. Those things are entertaining. It's all funny stuff. But when we utilize technology to do the thinking for us, or write the content for us and submit it as our own, we no longer benefit. We are slowly becoming disconnected from our own souls, and we lose the muscle memory of discernment. Maybe we can even throw the word lazy in there. And the routine of scrolling and utilizing technology to think for us drives a deeper rut over time. So think about the theory about how the Colorado River formed the Grand Canyon, how it continued eroding the Grand Canyon down. If we tried rerouting that river today, that would take a lot of time. And the same goes with our brains and our neurological pathways. So what does all this algorithm and AI stuff actually mean for us? It means that the things that we constantly consume are quietly shaping how we think. If you want negative, your feed on Facebook will show you the negative. If you want to be upset about something, you can easily find something to be angry about. The algorithms are designed to learn what captures your attention and then feed you more of it. AI is affirming. So why would we interact with other humans? Over time, these things that begin reinforcing certain perspectives and fears and desires. So between the voices that we grew up with, the culture around us, and the content we constantly consume, our minds are always being trained. And Scripture tells us that the battle is over our thinking, and it's not just psychological. There's also a spiritual dimension to it. And Ephesians 6:12 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Paul reminds us that the real battle isn't just what's happening around us, it's what's happening within us. The enemy understands something. If he can influence how we think, he can influence how we live. And that's why in Romans 12:2 it says, "Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." The world is constantly shaping how we think, but God invites us into something different, the renewing of our mind. And that leads me to my last point. The mind can be renewed. Did you know that you can retrain that narrator? That voice that tells you that you're not good enough, smart enough, pretty enough, the one that says you'll never succeed, you can retrain that. So I'm going to look at Philippians 4, and we're going to do that together today. And we're going to break this down. We're going to go through it slowly, piece by piece, but I'm going to read Philippians 4:4-9 in full, and then we're going to break it down. So it says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." I will say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts, your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. So let's walk through these verses real quick. He starts off by saying, rejoice in the Lord. That is not determined by your circumstances, no matter what you're going through. Rejoice in the Lord. Remember, Paul was imprisoned during this time. He was in a dungeon, most likely a hole in the ground. And he's saying, rejoice in the Lord. There's a positional connotation there. You are positioned in something deeper, always. And that is in the Lord. Rejoicing is not ignoring your problems. It is choosing where to put your mind and focusing on towards what is pure rather than when the negative narration starts to appear. And this aligns with what many psychologists have said about your attention. The mind tends to move towards whatever it repeatedly focuses on. And Jesus already stated this 2,000 years ago when he said, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. In other words, where your mind is, that's where your heart is at. And then Paul moves on into verse 4 and adds gentleness. Rejoice and let your gentleness be evident to all. What's really interesting is that Paul shifts from focus now to surrender. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. It's not denying that anxiety doesn't exist. It's giving the mind a direction for it. When people worry, the mind loops again and again and again. And it's typically the worst case scenario, right? Prayer interrupts that rumination and redirects it. Prayer changes what we've repeatedly placed before our minds. And in verse 7, it says that the God of peace will guard your hearts and mind. God's peace will stand watch over your heart and over your mind. It is that valuable to him. Paul is saying God's peace becomes a protector over your life. I love what Paul does next, and he adds a little filter now to all of this. He moves on into this idea of this intentional mental selection of what you choose to think of. And he says, think on whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, whatever is excellent or praiseworthy. What he is saying here is that we need to be conscious of the thoughts that occupy our mind. Remember, as I stated earlier, we have about 6,000 thoughts a day. That's a lot. And think of those thoughts as invitations. So how many of us have received an invitation to something? Maybe it's a wedding or a baby shower, a birthday. How many of us have turned down an invitation? Maybe a buddy calls you up and says, hey, let's go out to dinner. Have you ever turned that down? I know I have. Why? Maybe we're busy. Maybe we're tired. Maybe you have something else going on. We all know that every invitation that we get to something does not deserve our acceptance. We can deny an invitation to go to something. That's the same thing with the thoughts that enter our minds. Not every one of those thoughts require you to say yes. You can say no. Because the mind is shaped repeatedly by what it entertains. It repeats and becomes shaped by everything that you say yes to and everything you say no to. Paul ends verse 9 with this thought: whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. Neuroscience today confirms that repeated thoughts, practiced thoughts, those patterns, they strengthen neurological and neural pathways. Dr. Caroline Leaf, great doctor, Christian author, her book, Switch on Your Brain, which is a great book. I read it, I think, a couple of years ago now. It does a great connection with how God created us to how our brains and how our bodies and how we think and how all that works. And it's a really great book. It's called Switch on Your Brain. I'd really encourage you to read it if you haven't. Fantastic book. But she states in here, when you objectively observe your own thinking with the view to capture rogue thoughts, you rewire healthy new circuits into your brain. And Paul is saying the same thing in simple language. What you repeatedly practice becomes the new pattern of your life. And here's a hard fact. We can't outsource the renewing of our mind. You can't go to AI and start psychoanalyzing yourself. It's not going to work. It's it can be very, very destructive. I've read many articles recently about how AI is being almost used as a counselor or whatever is the case to psychoanalyze things, and how people are getting more, I don't want to say the word intimate, but it's intimate with AI rather than actual humans. They're developing a relationship with AI that's always constantly affirming, that never challenges them, that never challenges them to grow. And you can't outsource what you do in your prayer time with God to AI. That is counteractive, and it's not going to work. So as we looked over Philippians, Philippians 4, we can break this down into 4 different ideas. Anchor your focus in God. That is your prayer time, your quiet time, alone with God. That is your anchor. And bring your worries to Him instead of ruminating about them. Filter the thoughts you allow. And then practice those patterns until they reshape your life. I've said it from on the pulpit here before that renewing your mind and redoing these things, it may not look like anything today, but if it's a constant practice to put into practice, a year down the road, you're going to say, whoa, I'm glad I did that. But every time we say yes to something that maybe is detrimental, or we say no to something that's good, that reforms those neurological pathways and changes our trajectory. But if we do what Paul says in Philippians, over time, the mind begins to filter life a little bit differently. The same mind that learned certain patterns earlier in life can learn new ones through prayer, truth, and repetition, reshaping the way we think through Christ and with Christ. So at the beginning of this sermon, I posted a picture that potentially had the potential to read two different ways, right? What was the difference? Literacy. We understood how to read something correctly. The same thing is true with our thoughts. Many of us have lived for years believing the narration in our minds is automatically true. And Scripture tells us something completely different, and it typically does. It tells us that our thoughts can be taken captive. It's a subtle wording, but it's ever so important to understand. For me and my story, I can tell you it's not an easy victory, and it's not a one and done. I'm still working on things. I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever lost yourself into something? Have you ever listened to a song and forgot where you were for a moment? Or maybe you were just talking with a good friend and 3 hours flew by And for that whole time, you didn't once think about your car breaking down or the negative thing your boss said to you or how your coworker made you upset. Why does that happen? Because for once, we were fully safe and fully known. And that's what surrender looks like. I've lost myself in the Lord countless times. I became that child that finally knew in that moment what it looked like to not have to carry the weight of the world on my own. I didn't have to figure things out on my own. And it's those moments all my worries just seem to disappear because my focus is entirely on Him. Those moments in prayer, that is where the battle is actually fought. Those are the trenches. When the Apostle Paul talks about spiritual warfare and demolishing arguments, he's talking about what happens when you're on your knees. The battle isn't being fought when I'm worried about the next bill or the load of dishes I still have to do. The battle is fought when my mind is rewired. It's in those quiet moments, those intentional moments of prayer, when maybe you got some tears streaming down your face. That is when things change. And that is when I am simply and completely submitted to God. And it's those ordinary moments. They're not dramatic. It's something ordinary. It's when I choose humility over ego, persisting when the enemy whispers, "This is pointless. You're not changing." Yeah, you are. Because like I said, when you look down a year down the road and you look back at your life, you're like, yeah, I did change. So then, this is where the battle is fought. So when the fallout comes, because negative events are going to happen, the bottom is going to fall out at some point in some situation, some circumstance in your life, something is going to give way. The whole question is back to the ABC model. What belief am I going to form when that event occurs? When that action happens, what will be my belief in that event and from that event? My hope is that through prayer and through those trenches, that spiritual warfare, that surrender to God, that your response, your reaction is calm. It's peace. It's holiness. It's not anger or frustration or demolishing other people. And it all starts with awareness. Awareness that something inside my thinking needs to change. And as I began paying attention to my own thought life, I realized that some of the thoughts running through my mind weren't truth at all. They were just old interpretations I learned from the ages of 5 to 11 with a narcissistic stepmother. And they just kept playing on repeat, me trying to earn something that I didn't need to earn because I already had it through Christ. And I already had it through my church family and my friends. I had it through my wife, my kids. And I realized that those old interpretations were no longer serving me. Furthermore, they were actually hurting me. They kept me bound. They kept me trapped. They were suffocating me. They were suffocating the voice of God that was saying, just come. That awareness pushed me towards prayer. My prayers aren't perfect. They're messy. They never are. They're raw. They're honest. But the thing is, I started asking God to help me understand what is going on in my mind. And just letting you know that this type of prayer is dangerous. And it's dangerous. Why? Because you're going to grieve the life you had. The interpretations you lived with so long, you're going to grieve those because you lived with them so long and they kept you safe. They kept you secure. They made you survive throughout your life. And you need to grieve that. Welcome to spiritual warfare. Welcome to the spiritual warfare kind of prayer. But, there's a big but. God answers. And he answers in surprising ways. Sometimes the answers come when you're praying. Sometimes they come through conversations with other people. And like for me, one of the clearest moments that happened in the most ordinary places. I was making supper. That's when I realized, all of a sudden God hit me. Where my negative self-talk started, or where it was started to be formed. Back in my childhood, with my own belief and interpretation of a mother-like figure during my formative years. And it hit me hard, but it was delivered softly. See, God knows how to reach us, but we just have to be willing to become aware of what's happening inside our minds. Because if we never examine our thoughts, we will keep believing lies. And if you believe a lie long enough and repeat it long enough, it now becomes your truth. And that's why Scripture tells us that we need to take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. I remember one podcast I was listening to, it said you need to interrogate every thought. Like a police officer would interrogate a criminal. You have to do that with every single thought that enters your mind. Does it bring me closer to Christ? Period. Well, question mark. Same thing. Does it bring me closer to Christ? Taking thoughts captive begins with noticing the thought and asking a simple question. Is it actually true? And does it align with what God says about me and in his word? You don't need an algorithm to tell you who you are. You don't need to psychoanalyze yourself through AI. Bring all those thoughts to God. He can handle it. And when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. So, I leave you with this today. This week, let his truth do the rewiring.